Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be tackling something that I think all of us have quite a bit of experience with: effort, particularly when it comes to learning new things. You, a listener, sent us a really interesting article that appeared in Educational Psychology Review. And it goes beyond just, putting in the hours. It actually digs into effort from two, I think, really interesting angles. It talks about objective effort, the actual mental energy we're using, and perceived effort, how hard it feels like we're working, right?
Right. Yeah. I think a lot of people kind of have that intuition, that assumption that like the harder you work, the more you're going to learn. And this research really, I think, challenges that assumption. It highlights the fact that there's this really important distinction between, you know, how much effort you're putting in and how much effort you think you're putting in. And there's some really interesting implications for learning there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for you, the listener who sent this in, get ready for some potential light bulb moments here as we unpack this research and see what it suggests about how effort really plays a role in the learning process, and what the surprising role is that your perception of your own effort plays in the learning process. And so the big question, I think, for this deep dive is, does simply trying harder guarantee better learning, or is there a more complex story unfolding beneath the surface? So let's jump in. Okay, so this article starts off by talking about what they call objective effort.
hmm
What exactly do they mean by that?
Well, so you can think of objective effort as, not just the amount of time that you spend hitting the books, but, more specifically, the intensity of your mental workout during that time.
Hmm.
How much brain power are you really actively engaging within a given minute? Not just the total number of minutes clocked, but like how intense is your focus?
Got it. So it's that intensity, not just the duration, right? And the core argument that they make around this objective effort is that, more isn't always better, right? So just because you're really dialing up that mental energy doesn't mean that that directly translates to better learning.
Yeah, I think that's right. The authors, they make the point that objective effort itself isn't really a direct cause of learning gains. And so what they emphasize instead is that it's what you're actually doing mentally while you're putting in that effort. It's the quality of your processing over time that really matters. I think one analogy might be, exercising, just running on a treadmill for hours on end is not going to be as effective as, targeted exercises that really engage, specific muscle groups that you want to develop.
That's a great analogy. So it's not just how hard you push, but what you're pushing against. And they give an example, which I thought was great. They talk about students who were trying to learn statistical probability. And, one student manages to, really grasp it and another doesn't, even though they're both putting in equal objective effort. Can you walk us through that example?
Yeah. So they talk about, imagine you got two students both trying to work through these really difficult probability problems.
Mhm.
And, they're both sweating it mentally, both putting in a lot of effort to try to arrive at a solution. But one student, through their struggle, they managed to really understand the concept.
Yeah.
They grasped the logic behind it. And the other student, despite matching that same level of, mental strain, they just keep hitting dead ends and not really understanding what they're doing wrong.
Yeah.
And so I think this really highlights how effort alone isn't really enough. There's something else that has to be going on in order for learning to take place.
Right. Just grinding away at something doesn't guarantee understanding. And then they introduce this idea of what's called the expertise reversal effect. What is
Yeah.
that all about?
Yeah. So the expertise reversal effect is this idea that, learning methods that work really well for beginners might actually be less effective or even detrimental to people who already have some background knowledge in that area. So like imagine you're just starting to learn a new language. It might be really helpful to have these very clear grammar rules and, lots of examples laid out for you. But if you're already fairly fluent in that language, drilling yourself on those same basic grammar rules might not really get you very far. You'd be much better off immersing yourself in the language, having conversations, things like that.
Now, why does that happen? What's going on in our brains that makes different approaches more suitable at different, stages of expertise?
So one of the things that they point to is ideas like cognitive load theory to explain this. So, you can think of your working memory, the part of your brain that holds and manipulates information temporarily, kind of like a mental workspace. And this workspace has limited capacity. So when you're a beginner, you're still trying to build up this foundational understanding, a mental blueprint or a schema of the topic. And so, worked examples where they provide solutions, in a step-by-step way,
Hmm.
they can really help you to focus your mental energy on understanding those core principles. But if you jump straight into problem solving without that foundation, you might end up overloading your working memory. You're trying different things without really understanding why they work or why they don't work, and it kind of prevents you from developing that blueprint that you need.
Yeah, so trying to solve complex problems before you've even grasped the basics can actually backfire because your mental energy is being used up in the wrong ways.
That's right, yeah. And once you do have that kind of foundation in place, then you can really start using problem solving effectively to kind of deepen your understanding, practice applying the principles, and connecting ideas. And at that point, those step-by-step examples might actually become kind of redundant. They might not challenge you enough.
And the authors even offer kind of a different way of thinking about this, where they downplay the explicit focus on resources in the working memory. Why do they shift the emphasis like that?
Yeah. So I think their point is that while this idea of limited mental resources, it can be useful, the core issue isn't really about how much mental space you have. It's more fundamentally about whether you have the right building blocks, the existing knowledge, and whether the learning activity you're engaging in is the right fit for where you're at in terms of your understanding. So a complete novice might just not have the knowledge that they need in order to effectively tackle a complex problem, no matter how much mental space they might have available.
It's not just about having the fuel. It's about having the right kind of engine and knowing how to operate it. They also connect this idea to this research by Knuckles and colleagues on writing to learn, which is another really, I think, great example of how effort can be misdirected.
Right, yeah. So Knuckles and colleagues, they highlight this idea that if a student hasn't yet mastered the basic mechanics of writing, things like spelling, grammar, punctuation, then the act of writing itself can actually get in the way of learning.
Mm.
So if they're trying to write in order to understand something better, the mental effort of, forming the letters, getting the spelling right can actually take up so much of their cognitive capacity that they have less mental energy left over to really focus on the meaning of what they're trying to write.
So the effort of writing itself becomes a hurdle to the intended learning.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not because they lack intelligence or motivation. It's just they're missing these specific foundational skills that are necessary for that learning activity to be effective.
Right. So it's not a lack of resources. It's a lack of the right foundation.
Yep.
And that leads to a discussion of cognitive load theory and this really interesting idea of desirable difficulties.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets even more nuanced, the relationship between effort and learning. Can you talk about those a little bit?
Yeah. So cognitive load theory, basically, at its heart, it's all about how much different learning tasks demand of our working memory.
Right.
And they talk about different types of cognitive load. So there's, germane load, which is the kind of effort that's directed at actually understanding the material. And then there's intrinsic load, which is the inherent complexity of the topic itself. And then there's extraneous load, which is kind of like the wasted effort. This is caused by things like, poor instruction or confusing materials. And so the goal of instructional design is to really try to maximize that germane load and minimize that extraneous load.
Okay, so some mental effort is good.
Huh.
The germane load, because it's focused on making sense of things. Extraneous load is just that mental clutter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then desirable difficulties, it sounds like an oxymoron, right? But it's this idea that some learning activities that require a lot of effort actually lead to deeper and more lasting learning. And so, some examples of this are things like actively trying to recall information from memory, what's known as retrieval practice, or, spacing out your study sessions over time. And so these might feel a lot more difficult than just passively rereading your notes, but they actually force your brain to work harder in a way that actually strengthens your memory and understanding.
And so where does this idea of objective effort fit in with all of this discussion of cognitive load and desirable difficulties?
Yeah. So I think the authors would argue that both of these ideas, both cognitive load theory and desirable difficulties, they acknowledge that effort is involved in effective learning. But the main message is that it's really the kind of mental processing that you're doing that matters, not just the amount of effort that you're putting in. So, effective strategies, they increase that germane load or they introduce desirable difficulties. But they do that because they engage these specific cognitive processes that promote learning, not simply because they're more effortful.
Okay, so let me just recap this idea of objective effort before we move on. The takeaway here is that while it is, often a part of learning, it's the specific activities that you're engaged in that are effective learning strategies that are actually leading to the learning. More objective effort doesn't automatically equal better learning.
That's right, yeah. It's about working smarter, not just harder. And now this brings us to the second, and I think even more intriguing, perspective on effort, which is perceived effort.
Yeah, and so this is all about how hard it feels like you're working, right? And this seems like it could be very different from, that objective measure of mental energy that we were just talking about.
Yeah, it absolutely can. Perceived effort is all about, how do students subjectively define and judge the amount of mental exertion that they're investing in their learning? And the authors, they make a really compelling case that this perception of effort can have a huge impact on how they actually go about regulating their own learning and ultimately on their academic achievement.
So how does this subjective feeling of effort really shape our learning journey? So they lay out these 5 key themes in this article related to perceived effort. And so I think the first one is perceiver effort as a cue for metacognitive monitoring. So what is that all about?
So metacognitive monitoring is basically your brain's way of kind of checking in on its own learning. Like, are you understanding this? How well do you think you're going to do on that test? How confident are you in your answers? And so ideally, those judgments would be based on, having this clear and accurate understanding of what you know. But the reality is we don't have direct access to that, right? And so instead, we kind of have to rely on these different cues to make those assessments.
Right, so we're constantly trying to gauge our own learning by, I guess, interpreting these signals that are coming from our brains. And perceived effort is one of those signals, right? How hard it feels like we're working.
Right. And so the article talks about this big meta-analysis by Bars and colleagues that actually found a negative correlation here. So they found that the harder people felt like they were working while studying, the less well they thought they had learned the material.
That seems so counterintuitive. You would think if something felt really, really hard, like you were really struggling with it, that would lead to better learning.
Yeah, that's the intuition, right? But Van Gogh and colleagues found a very similar pattern when they were looking specifically at problem solving.
Yeah.
So, more perceived effort during problem solving was associated with lower judgments of learning afterwards. So, yeah, it seems like if something feels really difficult, you might kind of mistakenly conclude that you're not getting it.
Yeah, I think we've all been there. Now, they do point out that this relationship isn't always quite so clear-cut, right? It depends on where the students believe that effort is originating from.
Right. So that's a really important moderating factor here. So if students attribute that increased effort to the difficulty of the material itself, like they just think, oh, this is just really hard, what the authors call data-driven effort, then that negative relationship we just talked about tends to hold. But if students feel like they are consciously choosing to invest more effort, like they're using a more deliberate strategy, what they call a self-regulated effort, then the relationship between perceived effort and judgments of learning becomes a lot weaker.
So if you feel like you're actively choosing to work harder, you're less likely to interpret that as, as a sign that you're not learning.
That's interesting. And then the article talks about this idea from Scheider and colleagues that our perception of effort can actually be biased.
Yeah, so their argument is that because our judgments about how much effort we're putting in are based on inferences, just like any other judgment that we make, they can be inaccurate and influenced by all sorts of things that aren't directly related to how much objective effort we're putting in. And so this is really important because it means that we can't just rely on students' reports of their perceived effort as definitive proof that, they were putting in more or less objective effort. Their perception might be skewed.
Right. So if how hard it feels like we're working isn't always an accurate measure of the actual mental energy we're using.
Yeah.
And if that objective effort isn't directly causing learning in the first place, then using effort to judge how well we're learning might not be the best approach. Right, yeah. The article emphasizes that you're only going to be accurate if you use effort as a cue for monitoring your learning, if that feeling of effort is actually aligned with effective processing. But as we've been talking about, effort itself isn't the primary driver of that effective processing.
Right. And they use an example, I think, involving diagramming. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. So imagine you have a student who can create a really great diagram, a really insightful diagram with very little perceived effort. They're like, oh, this was easy, but it's a great diagram. Well, in that case, that low feeling of effort combined with the fact that they produce this great diagram, that might actually be a good indication that they understand the material, right?
Right.
But if another student, puts in very little effort and they produce a really terrible diagram, then that low effort is clearly not an accurate reflection of their understanding. So it really depends on the context and the outcome, whether that perceived effort is actually a useful signal or not.
Okay, so just because something feels hard doesn't mean you're not learning. And just because something feels easy doesn't mean you've mastered it. Now, let's move on to this idea of control decisions. What do they mean by control decisions?
Yeah. So control decisions are all about the choices that students make about how they're going to manage their learning. So, for example, if a particular task feels incredibly difficult, are they going to decide to give up? Or are they going to try to find an easier way to learn it? Or are they going to persist, even though it's challenging, because they have a feeling that they're actually making progress? So Van Gogh and colleagues, they point out that we still don't know that much about how students actually weigh that feeling of mental effort when they're making these really important learning decisions.
It's that classic dilemma. Do you stick with the harder path that's going to maybe be more rewarding? Or do you go for the easier route that might not get you to the same level? So interesting. Now they have some research that actually shows that people might actually be avoiding effective strategies just because they perceive them as requiring more effort. And this was research on retrieval practice, which we've talked about on the show before. It's this really powerful technique where you actively try to pull information out of your memory. And it can definitely feel more demanding than just rereading, but it really strengthens those neural connections. And this research suggests that students might actually be avoiding retrieval practice because it just feels harder.
Yeah, that's right. So Carpenter and colleagues, they found that students sometimes avoid using effective learning strategies like retrieval practice, precisely because they feel that they require more effort, even though we know that these strategies lead to better learning.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Kirk Johnson and colleagues found in their study, too. Students reported that retrieval practice felt more effortful than just rereading, and so they were less likely to choose retrieval practice when they were learning new material. And interestingly, they also thought that retrieval practice was less effective for learning, which could be another reason why they're avoiding it.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So it feels harder, and they don't even necessarily realize that it's better. And so that raises the question, would students still avoid retrieval practice if they knew that it was more effective?
That's a great question.
Yeah. It's a good one. And Carpenter and colleagues, they actually suggest that maybe one of the reasons that students avoid retrieval practice is because of how they conceptualize it. So some students might see retrieval practice primarily as a way to kind of check what they know, like a self-testing tool, rather than as an active learning technique that strengthens their memory. And so if their goal is just to kind of figure out what they know, they might opt for the easier, less strenuous method of just rereading. Okay, so this brings us to theme number 3, the role of effort in what they call metacognitive self-regulated learning. And so I guess the first question is the very act of planning and monitoring and adjusting our own learning strategies, is that effortful?
So I think the answer, as the authors would probably say, is it depends. The amount of mental energy involved in self-regulation probably varies a lot depending on, what aspect of learning the student is trying to regulate. And so this raises some other questions like, is it even useful to try to measure the effort that's involved in self-regulation? If so, how do we do it? How do we measure that in a valid way for different aspects of learning?
Yeah, it does sound very complicated to try to isolate the specific type of effort. How do you separate, the effort that you're putting into planning your study session versus the effort that you're putting into understanding a particular concept? It seems like a very difficult thing to measure.
Yeah, absolutely. And the authors, they refer to some work by Idle and colleagues that remind us that, our motivation and our ability to focus our attention tend to kind of decrease over these longer study periods, which might make students less willing to engage in these really effortful compensatory processes when they run into learning difficulties. And then, there's also the kind of obvious point that if two strategies lead to the same outcome, it makes sense to choose the one that feels less effortful.
Right. Makes sense to go for the more efficient road if you're going to end up in the same
Yeah.
place. Yeah, absolutely. And they also talk about the connection between how accurately we can monitor our own learning and the cognitive resources we have available, right?
Right. So Prince and colleagues suggest that when we're faced with really demanding learning tasks, the ones that really kind of suck up a lot of our mental processing power, we might have fewer cognitive resources left over to effectively monitor how well we're actually learning.
So if you're really having to work hard to just process the information coming in, you might not have as much bandwidth left over to actually think critically about how well you're learning it.
Right. And Van Gogh and colleagues offer a similar explanation for why our confidence judgments about our learning might be less accurate for these more complex problems. The higher the cognitive load, the more effort we have to devote to just solving the problem itself, which leaves less mental energy available to track our progress and really form these accurate judgments about how well we're doing.
Yeah, it's like juggling, right? Like you can only juggle so many balls at once. If you add too many, you're going to drop them all. So this leads to theme number 4, and this one seems really particularly important for researchers in this field. It's this idea that measuring effort, both how hard we feel we're working and the actual mental energy that we're expending, is actually really difficult to do in this context of self-regulated learning.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. And the authors point out several limitations in the ways that people have tried to do this in the past. So, like, one way that people try to infer, sustained effort over time is they look at how well students do on material that was studied earlier in a session versus material studied later in the session. But you run into problems with that because, other factors might be influencing those results, like fatigue. You might just be tired at the end of the session, and you might not perform as well. And it's not necessarily because you weren't putting in effort. And plus, if you're trying to link effort to performance, you run into this kind of circular reasoning problem.
And just looking at the total time that someone spends on a task isn't a foolproof measure either.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
That could be influenced by so many different things. It could be how difficult the task is, the learning strategies that they're using, their individual learning pace. It doesn't necessarily reflect how much mental effort they're putting in minute to minute.
Right. And they also talk about using secondary tasks as a potential way to gauge objective effort. Can you talk about how that works?
Yeah, so the idea there is that if someone is really focusing a lot of their mental energy on a primary learning task, their performance on another task that they're doing at the same time, a secondary task that also requires cognitive resources, is probably going to go down. So if you see a measurable drop in their performance on that secondary task, you can assume that more of their mental resources are going to that primary learning task. And so you can say that they're putting in more effort.
So you give them like a simple task to do at the same time. And if they can't do that task very well, then you can assume that they're putting more effort into the first task.
Right, exactly.
Now, the article does point out that there are some problems with this method too.
Yeah, there are a lot of assumptions built into that interpretation of the results, assumptions about, how we actually distribute our cognitive resources that might not always be accurate. And, asking students to report on how much effort they feel like they're putting in, that's a really common method, but it only captures their subjective experience, right? It doesn't tell us anything about how much objective effort they're actually putting in.
Right. So it's all about perceptions. And I think the biggest point they make is that it's really, really difficult to separate out the effort that is going specifically to learning the content versus the effort that's going into regulating the learning process.
Yeah, that's a big one. And I love the example that they use. They talk about a student who's trying to understand photosynthesis. And they decide to use this mental imagery technique to try to visualize, the process of photosynthesis.
Yeah.
And so the decision to use that imagery is a self-regulatory choice, right? That's a strategy that they're employing to try to understand. But the act of creating that mental image and working with it, that involves all sorts of other cognitive processes. So how do you really separate out the effort that went into making that strategic decision from the effort that went into the visualization itself? That's really hard to tease apart.
Yeah, and I think it highlights the fact that it's all connected, right? It's hard to measure the effort of one part of a system in isolation.
Yeah, it's all integrated. So when a student reports that they're putting in X amount of effort, how much of that is about, planning their study session? How much is about, understanding a concept? How much is just about their overall, feeling of mental exertion?
hmm
It's hard to know.
Yeah, and so that brings us to theme number 5, which is how understanding perceived effort can actually inform the development of better learning interventions.
And this is where it gets really practical, right?
Right, yeah. So if we can understand what students perceive as being effortful, then that can give us some really valuable clues about why they might be resistant to using certain learning strategies, even when we know that those strategies are effective. So for example, let's say that researchers discover this new learning technique that has been shown to be really, really effective. But students keep saying that it just feels too mentally demanding. Well, that's really useful information, right? Because it can tell us how to design interventions that are more effective. Yeah, so if it actually is too demanding, maybe the intervention should focus on ways to reduce the cognitive demands of the strategy. Maybe you break it down into smaller steps or provide more scaffolding. But if the students are actually capable of doing it, but they're just not motivated because it feels hard, then the intervention might focus on, explaining the benefits of the strategy, or maybe on finding ways to increase their motivation to actually use it.
Exactly. Yeah. And because perceived effort can really influence how students monitor their own learning, understanding when that feeling of effort might be misleading can also be really helpful in terms of designing interventions. So you might want to help students focus less on how hard something feels and more on these other indicators of their understanding, like can they explain the concept in their own words?
Hmm.
Can they use it to solve a problem? Those kinds of things.
Right. So focus more on what they can actually do, less on how hard it felt to get there.
Yeah, exactly. And you could even try to train students to recognize when their feeling of effort is actually useful information and when it might be leading them astray. But, as the authors point out, both of these approaches are really difficult. It's hard to reliably generate those kinds of diagnostic cues, and our understanding of when perceived effort is going to be accurate is still developing.
Right. And so that really speaks to the need for a better overall understanding of how all of these things are connected, right? Effective processing, diagnostic cues, and perceived effort.
Absolutely. If we can develop a really strong theory that connects those three things, it would be hugely valuable.
Yeah. So this has been, I think, a really interesting deep dive into this topic, a topic that we all have a lot of personal experience with. And I think, just to recap some of the key takeaways for our listener. While objective effort is often a necessary part of learning, it's important to remember that it's not effort in and of itself that guarantees learning. The quality of your processing, the strategies you use, those are the things that really drive learning gains.
Right. And equally important, how you perceive your own effort. That can really have a big impact on how you approach your learning. It influences how you judge your own progress, the choices you make about how to study, and your motivation to keep going when things get tough.
Absolutely. So for you, the learner, the takeaway here is, don't just push harder, right? Work smarter. Pay attention to how much effort something feels like it's taking, but also take a step back and ask yourself, are the strategies I'm using actually working? The easiest approaches might not always be the best ones, and understanding why can help you to make better choices in your own learning journey.
And I think another really good takeaway is that it's important to reflect on your own experiences. Think about those times when you felt like you were working incredibly hard, but you weren't really seeing the results. What were you actually doing during that time? What strategies were you using? And then also think about the times when you were surprised by how much you learned from an activity that didn't feel all that strenuous. Maybe the key is understanding that difference. What's the difference between those two situations?
That's a great question. A question I think we all need to ask ourselves. And so this is really just the beginning of this conversation about the relationship between effort and learning. And we hope that you'll continue to think about your own experiences and how they connect to what we've talked about today. And, take some time to reflect on your own study habits and your learning strategies and see how the things that we discussed today might apply to your own pursuit of knowledge and mastery. Thanks so much for taking this deep dive with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.